We are finally finished with the Arctic blast that came through Florida last week. Across the state, we experienced temperatures that many people haven't felt in over a decade. Plants froze, grass turned brown almost overnight, exposed pipes burst by the thousands, and in some places, entire fields of crops were lost when irrigation lines froze, burst, and then covered crops and froze solid in the cold. It felt like a once-in-a-lifetime event, but for those who know the state's history, this was not the first time Florida was brought to its knees by the cold. In our last video, we covered the Great Freezes of 1894-95 and the Blizzard of 1899, events that devastated communities and permanently changed Florida forever. But many of you pointed out that there were even earlier freezes. We're going back farther in time, back to a time when Florida looked nothing like the one we know today. A Florida with scattered log forts, tiny settlements, and dense wilderness for hundreds of miles. And a winter so cold that rivers froze solid, crops were wiped out, and parts of Florida were changed forever. This is the story of the Great Florida Freeze of 1835 and the earlier freeze of 1766. To understand the impact of the 1835 freeze, we have to understand what Florida was like in the 1830s. In 1835, Florida was a sparsely populated frontier territory. The United States had taken over power from Spain in 1821. Just over a decade later, the territory was still developing, and much of it remained wild and unsettled. Most of the white population lived in the northern part of the territory. Settlements were clustered around places like St. Augustine, Jacksonville, Tallahassee, St. Marks, and Pensacola, and a few river towns along the St. Johns. Plantations were scattered across North Florida, especially in fertile areas where cotton, sugar, and corn were grown. But outside the settlements, in the interior of Florida, the peninsula was wild, dominated by dense forest, deep swamps, and vast prairies. This part of Florida was home to the Seminoles. The Seminole people had formed from multiple Native American tribes who had moved to Florida during the 1700s. They established villages throughout central and southern Florida, often in remote areas. By the 1820s and 30s, tensions between white settlers and the Seminoles was growing. The United States government was trying to remove Native American tribes from their land east of the Mississippi and relocate them to what is now Oklahoma. By late 1835, the situation had reached a breaking point. In December of that year, a column of U.S. soldiers was marching through what is now Sumter County. They were ambushed by Seminole warriors in what became known as the Dade Massacre. Out of 110 soldiers, 108 were killed. It was one of the worst one-sided defeats in U.S. history, and it marked the beginning of the Second Seminole War. Before the citrus boom of the late 1800s, Florida still had a growing economy. Wild citrus trees grew across parts of the state, and by the early 1800s, commercial groves were growing along rivers like the St. Johns. Plantations and small farms were growing citrus, sugarcane, and cotton. In St. Augustine, citrus was already a major part of the economy. Before the 1835 freeze, the city was reportedly producing 2 to 2.5 million oranges each year. Many of these groves had trees that were decades, sometimes even a century old. The winter of 1835 brought one of the most severe cold waves ever recorded across the southeastern United States. On February 2, 1835, an intense cold front pushed deep into Florida. Temperatures plummeted across South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. When the worst of the freeze struck, Jacksonville had temperatures drop to around 8 degrees. At Fort King, what would become modern-day Ocala, temperatures were recorded at 11 degrees. Temperatures that were almost unheard of in the Florida Peninsula. This cold was so intense and hung around for so long that the mighty St. Johns River froze. Ice formed along the banks and stretched dozens of feet out from shore. In some places, the river froze far enough that people could walk out onto the ice. In St. Augustine, temperatures reportedly dropped to 7 degrees. Many said it was the coldest weather ever experienced in Florida up to that time. Fruit trees across the region were killed, some over 100 years old. Entire groves were wiped out, roots and all, as far south as modern-day Tampa. After the freeze, one person described the state looking as if a fire had swept across it. The 1835 freeze reshaped Florida's agriculture. It was so severe that it ended attempts to grow citrus in parts of South Carolina, Georgia, and parts of northern Florida. Every major freeze pushed farmers further down the peninsula, but in 1835, the consequences were far worse. When the Great Freeze of 1835 hit, it came at one of the worst possible times in the territory's history. The cold had already devastated agriculture and plantations of North Florida. Orange trees, sugarcane, vegetables, and other crops were wiped out. But before they had time to recover, war erupted. By late 1835, tensions between the United States government and the Seminoles had reached a breaking point. The government was determined to remove the Seminoles from Florida and relocate them west of the Mississippi. The Seminoles, who had built their lives in Florida's interior, refused. Years of pressure and broken treaties exploded into open conflict after the Dade Massacre. The attack shocked the nation and marked the official start of the Second Seminole War. The war lasted 7 years and became the longest and most expensive Indian War in U.S. history. Florida's population was small, with around 34,000 white residents and slaves scattered across the territory. The Seminole population was also small, numbering around 5,000 people. The war would devastate the land and reshape Florida forever. The effects of the freeze and the war were catastrophic. Plantations that had already been damaged by the cold were abandoned as fighting spread across the territory. War parties raided farms and settlements, and many enslaved people joined the Seminoles in the conflict. Entire communities were destroyed. When the war ended in 1842, thousands of Seminoles had been forcibly removed west, though several hundred remained, hidden in the Florida Everglades, ready to fight again in the Third Seminole War. The freeze of 1835 was devastating, but it was not the first time that Florida had been hit by a powerful cold front. Decades earlier, another cold front had struck. We have to go back to when Florida wasn't even part of the United States. In 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, Spain traded Florida to Great Britain. The British divided the region into two colonies, East and West Florida. At the time, Florida was still one of the least populated places in the British Empire. The population had grown from a few thousand under the Spanish to around 17,000 by 1783. The British government offered land grants to settlers, especially wealthy planters from the Carolinas and Georgia. They began establishing plantations along the St. Johns River and other fertile areas. They grew crops like indigo, rice, sugar, and citrus. In the winter of 1865 to 66, a severe cold front hit much of the southeast. Frost and freezing conditions hit plantations along the St. Johns River and near St. Augustine. Citrus trees, sugarcane, and other crops were damaged. The freeze slowed the development of British Florida. Botanist John Bartram and his son William had been traveling across East Florida in a dugout canoe when the cold front hit. He wrote,
"The ground was froze an inch thick on the banks of the St. Johns River. This was the fatal night that destroyed the lime, citron, and banana trees in Augustine."
The freezes of 1766 and 1835 struck Florida at critical moments in its history. Both changed the direction of Florida's future. When Spain regained Florida in 1783, the region was still sparsely populated. It would take decades before agriculture would thrive again. Every time the Arctic air pushes south, it reminds us of the winters that came before. Winters that froze rivers, killed orange groves, and changed the entire state. I want to thank y'all for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace.